Dear listeners, welcome to the first edition of our new podcast, Edu-Cast, which focuses on the fascinating world of education. In this particular episode, we will be focusing on critical thinking and problem-solving skills in early year education as a foundation for lifelong learning. I will be your host, Filips, currently a first-year student, high school and middle school still fresh in mind. And joining me are two esteemed experts in the field, Dr. Romey, who is the director of International School of Riga, and Ginta Kārkliņa, the PYP coordinator and School 2030 senior expert in primary year education, as well as helping develop support materials for the teachers. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Philip.
Okay, now let's firstly start by laying some kind of foundation. Multiple researchers, for example, from Journal of Education Psychology, have demonstrated that such skills as critical thinking and problem solving are essential not only for the development and success in the academic field, but it also spills into various other aspects of life, as well as lots of researchers in neuroscience have highlighted that this early year education plays a significant role in shaping the cognitive abilities of these children. And by providing these young learners with, for example, spaces with safe exploration and inquiry, we can foster these skills. So having laid some kind of a groundwork, we can maybe move on to the first question. That would be, how would you describe the importance of critical thinking and problem-solving skills in children's development based on your experience and expertise?
I think the importance of critical thinking has been highly developed over the last few years. Like if you think about how we've progressed, like the agriculture age, the industrial age, and now you look at the brand for this is the conceptual age that was sort of typecasted by Daniel Pink in A Whole New Mind. And he really addresses this idea that if you look at the skills and knowledge people need, you need to wrap that into conceptual belief so that kids can build their critical thinking skills upon that. The more they know, the more they can delve into, think critically about it. If they don't have a base of knowledge and skills and facts, then they can't build a conceptual understanding, and that conceptual place is where they can think critically because they can transfer it to other settings. If I only know facts, I can't say like, oh, this fact transfers to another space. And that's really, if you want kids to be able to analyze and think critically, they have to be able to take that conceptual step.
Yep. And also like in the job environment for us in the university, most of the professors say that it is much more important to learn how to learn rather than the hard things that you learn. So critical thinking is the most important thing. And also in the job market, like most of the things that are going on now, it is not about the skills that you have, but how quickly can you develop new learnings and how can you adapt quickly. So that also goes out.
They say like 47% of the jobs that we have now won't exist in 10 years. So when they're looking at skills that they want students to have, it's collaboration, it's the ability to adapt to new environments, to think conceptually. So those are the critical thinking skills that employers are looking for because the jobs that they want to hire people for now aren't even developed yet.
Yeah. And next question goes out to you, Ginta. From your perspective as a curriculum expert, how does early year education contribute to the development of these skills, so specifically the first years of the education?
I always say that just like every building needs a strong foundation, early years is a foundation for school. That's where everything starts. In early years, at the moment, I think the main goal is for adults, for teachers, also for parents, not to stop the students using their critical thinking and problem-solving skills, because little kids, when they are born, when they start getting to know the world, they are little explorers. They want to find out, they want to try, they want to experiment. And that's how they build these critical thinking skills, by trying, by failing, through trial and error. And by trying to get them very quickly into the correct ways, into the correct answers, meaning very well, of course, we tend to stop them from experimenting, stop them from trying out, from problem solving, from trying to find out by themselves. And this is the main role of early years, allowing them, giving them time and space. And as you mentioned before, environment and the time and space for inquiry, where they can figure out the answers, they can figure out how to do things, they can reinvent the wheel again if needed, but at least that's theirs and they can then use it later.
If I can piggyback on that, like I think when we want our students to be able to do these high, like our kids to be able to do these high level math skills, people don't understand that the foundation for literacy and numeracy is developed in the preschool to grade 2. So that foundation is laid then, and that is developed by kids making sounds and then understanding slowly, like this letter represents a sound, but that doesn't come naturally in your brain. Like reading is one of those things that don't come naturally. So kids have to be able to experiment with sounds and understanding that. And numeracy, like you just think kids playing in a sandbox, like filling up a cup and pouring it into another cup and understanding like, oh, this is bigger than this. That is the foundation of numeracy and spatial relations. And they have to be able to play and do that for them to develop those high-level math skills that we want them to do when they're, in 11th and 12th grade. But that foundation is in preschool.
And there is research that the success in math is not determined by how quickly and how early you learn the numbers or counting or number operations, but it's 3 totally different things. Patterns, which involves critical thinking, problem solving, prediction, ability to predict and see the connections. Spatial awareness, which is all block building, experimenting, climbing on the chairs, climbing under the tables, everything else. And number sense, which comes before actually using real numbers. It's through playing and experimenting. What's in this hand, I have this many things. In this hand, I have this many things. What's more, what's less? What, like small things are more, bigger things are less.
Okay, I think you both already answered like the next question, which would be like, could you provide some real life examples of how these skills manifest outside the classroom, so in the real world, so sandbox, spatial awareness?
That's why it's so important. Like our early years spends a lot of time in the forest, and that is a huge space for them to develop not only their numeracy skills, but they are building stuff. They're seeing how like angles, if I put the trees like this, will it stay up? If I'm going to build a fort, like you don't think about how much thought goes into this, but if this one is too heavy, they're not going to line up. If their angles are off, they're going to fall down. They learn that just by watching and building.
And you mentioned how do those skills show up outside the classroom walls in real life. What we want to think is that classroom is real life for those children for so many years, because that's where they spend most of the time. It should be real life for them, where they actually live, rather than an artificial place where something is made for them artificially. It's their life there.
Nice. Okay, I think now we can move on to the second segment, which is a little bit more fun, and we'll be doing identifying some common misconceptions in the realm of education, so a little bit of myth busting. So the first myth would be that children are either left-brained or right-brained. I know some people from my class the previous years, they were, oh no, I'm such a right-brained person, I can't study that way, I can't study this way. But is there any scientific backing of this statement that people are left-brained, right-brained?
I think people naturally have an inclination to be creative or more analytical, and you would consider that right-brained or left-brained. But the idea that you are wholly one way or another is just not true. When you look at the research now, that people used to think, and I think math is one of these things that we really say, like, oh, I can do math or I can't do math, that has just been blown out of the water now that we know about neuroplasticity. there was this idea that your brain is set, but that's not true. You build new synaptic connections every time you learn something new. So you start cross-talking and then you understand, and the words don't matter, but there's a section of your brain, the corpus callosum, that connects the two sides of your brain together. So you can cross-talk, and that helps people develop both sides of their brain equally. There was some research, just to further my point about neuroplasticity, that they actually took out part of a child's brain. She was 9 years old. She had some issues. She was having seizures. So they actually cut out like one side of her brain. And her brain regenerated those connections so quickly that she could still use both sides of her brain. So like neuroplasticity is a thing. We can build new connections, and kids aren't one way or another. It's just when you make a connection, and while it's malleable, if you do that, then you'll be able to do that skill forever. It's kind of considered an open window period, and those are the times that you can build your skills.
So an open window period, that is like the early years of your...
It's kind of, it doesn't matter. Your brain grows forever. We used to sort of think you got to this age and then it stopped. But now with this research with the neuroplasticity, they've understood that your brain will continue to develop synaptic connections as long as you can. But I don't know how deep you want me to go, but there's what happens is your brain goes through pruning. It's because you have all these synaptic connections and these dendrites are out there and your brain's getting kind of messy, and it's like, oh, you haven't used this in a bit, and so your brain will prune it. So if you haven't been using that skill, then you probably won't develop it. But if you've connected it and it's moved from your short-term memory into your long-term memory, you will master the skill, but you have to keep practicing it. So it's there, but your brain will prune things out. That's why it's super important. Like during teen years, there's a ton of pruning. You sort of think of development. Early years is a huge, like birth to 2, huge brain development, but it's also in those middle school years when kids' frontal lobes aren't developed, and so they're doing some risky behaviors. That's why it's super important to educate kids about drugs, because that really impacts that development. Risky behaviors impact the development of the connections. So you want to make sure they stay away from risky behaviors in those times.
And also, expanding on the same question, I had recently heard that there was also a belief that you can either, I learn better from reading, I learn better if I hear something. Is there some truth to, and maybe about like brain pruning, or how do you call it? If you, for example, you only listen to stuff, can you like prune the part of your brain which registers information from reading, or is it murky waters?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't, because they're just different. It's like your occipital lobe versus your temporal lobe. Like they're different lobes of your brain that connect and that take in different information. So pruning is separate from that. That's like a skill I'm trying to learn, and then I don't know how to do that anymore. But like the lobes of your brain are still there. People are inclined to be, like I would still say, I am not an auditory learner. I don't know if it has to do more with ADHD and my capacity to pay attention that long. But kids definitely have preferences, and there is this belief, like, it's an old quote, but like, if you say it, but I don't know it until I do it. And that's why teaching is a great way to build skills, because not only are you developing it for yourself, but you're helping someone else. So they would still say that most people tend to be tactile learners. Like I need to practice it and do it. And that fewer people are auditory learners, although most of school is auditory.
And people probably are taught out of being tactile.
Yeah. Because especially for girls, sort of this compliance is a big thing, relationship and connection. Boys do it in a different way. Girls tend to want to be compliant, and so they're going to learn to sit and listen more, because that compliance tends to be more important.
Okay, moving on to the second myth that we have is that learning is primarily about memorization, and we talked previously about this, that is, well, not so. How would you address such a misconception in your teaching practices, for example?
I think that misconception has started from the time when memorization was the main way how to pass on the information. when schools, this was the way how to get the information, what was in the books and in teachers' heads onto students. So they had to memorize. They were not going and sitting in the libraries and studying books for months and years. That was the quickest way. Now it's not that important anymore to just give away the information. Now it's more important because information is all around and we can find it. But it doesn't mean that you don't need to memorize things. You still need to memorize things so you could understand and you could do things more efficiently and quicker. But now, because there is so much information and there's so many ways to find it, it's so important to actually understand what you are learning so you can sort that information and see what's valuable, what's not, what's true, what's not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and for example, I remember in my early year education, it was like mostly memorization. Just remember some songs, remember the alphabet, and has some things. How has it changed, for example, from the 2000s till now in Latvia? Let's say the education of the early years, or
it's still changing.
Okay,
it's still changing because the people who grew up in those years and who were taught that way. People do what they are familiar with, so teachers are still very often tend to go back to what they are familiar with. They are also learning how to teach in a way that builds understanding more than just rely on memorization and facts. And it's bit by bit, but I think people see the results once they try, once they see, and then they allow children to make mistakes and they allow children to make those connections by themselves and to have those aha moments, and it's like, oh, I finally understood, and then they see the result. That's what helps them to change.
I think there's something to understand what you mean by memorizing, right? Because there's this idea that I'm going to cram and memorize this for a test and then I'm going to forget it, versus I am moving something from my working memory into my long-term memory. So if you have it just in your short-term memory, that's like moments, and then you forget it, and that's memorizing it. I'm going to take this quick test, I'm going to leave. But if you are taking the information and then you're walking it through that process that goes from your short-term to your working memory to your long-term memory, it is technically then memorized. Like, you remember it, but it's for a different purpose. And so I think part of it is that there are things that we memorize. You probably know the Latvian national anthem by heart. Like, right, there's things that you memorize, but they have a purpose. It's not just to memorize. So I think you have to really be careful about how you're phrasing that. Like, do I want you to just memorize this, take a test and forget it? Or do I want you to move it to your long-term memory to hold, to help you for future learning?
And memory has to be trained.
Yeah.
That muscle as well. You have to memorize some things so the brain would get used to doing that.
Like, you need to know your phone number. There's things you need to know. I mean, maybe not with phones anymore, but like, I still remember my high school phone number, but I don't know my current phone number.
No, because I remember I had some problems. I don't know when you get to learn dividing, because I remember in the third grade or something like that, when we first started, I just remembered, okay, 4 divided by 2 is 2, but I didn't conceptualize like what even dividing is. But then one time in some kind of a consultation, I think she brought up this example of like a cake. Oh, you split it into 2. Oh, you have 2 halves, then you have 4 halves, and that's and after that, dividing just came so easy.
And then it's easier to memorize as well.
Yeah, and then it's easier
because
to
you
memorize.
Understand what it is.
Basis,
it's not just like some
fragmentals of everything,
unconnected things.
Connected, yeah. Third myth, the use of worksheets as a teaching tool. And there's a common belief that worksheets are effective for promoting deep learning. What does research have to say about this? And if I can add something to that, what even is deep learning? Firstly, deep learning, and after that, the worksheets as an effective way of deep learning.
I would say that deep learning is the learning that leads to understanding and ability to apply what you have learned, rather than just memorization for short-term memory, not the long-term. And worksheets, there are different types of worksheets, but typically people understand with worksheets is there's a task that you can quickly do, for example, in the younger years, some matching, some filling in the blanks or something. something that has the correct answer, which you either know or you don't know or you can guess. And if you can do the worksheet by either knowing or not knowing, then what's the point? If you know it, then what's the point of doing the worksheet? If you don't know it, then you will be guessing, and what's the point then of doing it? So, but there are worksheets, also different worksheets where they are kind of like organizers for thoughts, for thinking, where you need to fill in the blanks for, like, for example, when you do the experiment, it gives you the sequence, how to follow, what steps to follow, but then you are doing the experiment and you are writing the answers, and those answers may differ from one student to another. That's a different type of worksheet. But those first worksheets, which are just right or wrong answers, I would say mostly those are busy works. So sometimes you can use it for practicing. Sometimes you can use it when you need to just occupy people, and rather than actually give them time to learn. But the other worksheets are good organizers for thinking, for providing answers that are deeper.
Okay, thank you. And fourth and final myth, and personally my personal vendetta, more homework leads to better academic performance. And please tell me that this is not true.
It's not true.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we answered the question.
But if you could go into depth, why?
Research would show that homework, especially, it's not so much true in secondary school as kids get older, but in primary, the more homework they have, the more likely they are to disengage with school later, like when you want them to start doing some other things in high school. So there is, I want to say zero, but that's probably not true. There's not that I have found research that would support having homework in primary school. Reading is different. That's sort of a nightly reading, lap time, minutes. They show that the more minutes small kids have on their parents' laps reading builds their vocabulary. Like, I think it was like 200 to 300 words are kids will be their vocabulary if they haven't had enough lap time with their parents, versus like 11,000 words if they have had lap time with their parents just reading to them at that level. And then as they get older, you can read page for page. It's a great connection time. It's a great way to build understanding, build vocabulary.
I would say it also depends on what kind of homework is that and what you understand with homework. If you understand just doing the exercises for practice, something that you did at school just to practice more, that's one thing. Something that you have to actually figure out by yourself without teacher's help, that's another thing. And then why do you then are doing it at home, not at school with teacher and with others? Another homework could be that it supports learning at school, but it connects home and school. For example, if they at school are talking about families, about generations, about different lifestyles, then homework can be talk to grandparents, talk to some relatives, and then find out what their childhood was like. So that's also that's homework, but that's a different type of homework.
There's also the issue, I think, which is maybe more in secondary or upper primary, like grades 4 and 5. But if you're using that as a measure for identifying students' understanding, you actually have no capacity to know who did the work. So if you assign something and then kids bring it back and you're like, you got 100%. But you don't know then when they do assessments, like, you have to be able to check for understanding, because if there hasn't been a way to do that, you have no proof of who did it. So if there's something you want them to talk to their family about, if there's something you want them to like delve deeper on it, like, that's a great question, I don't know the answer, look it up and let's talk about it tomorrow. Like, those kinds of things, I guess, could be homework, but I don't know. You just really have to be mindful, especially I think as kids get older, to understand who is doing the work and who's doing the thinking. Especially like there's, I don't know, kids get math tutors and then it's like, well, great, tell your tutor they got a B, but I don't know what you know. Yeah,
that's the same, because I remember when I was small, especially with the first grades and maths, like, you're sitting at the table with your dad already a
Crying.
It's
Yeah,
crying.
yeah.
And after some time, it's like he'll just he won't take it. You'll have to write it, so the teacher doesn't see that there's a different handwriting. But he's like, okay, what do we say? What is 1 + 1? 3. Yeah. No, it's 2.
It's 2. Just write it down. Yeah. Well, and I really like to. I think kids don't get enough time to be kids, and I always tell them in the beginning, like, if at any point anybody is in tears, the grown-up or the child, like, stop. That is not the intention of anything we would ever send home. And I'm going to say this, but I do work at home, but I'm going to pretend like I don't. Like, most people, you don't want to go home and work more. Nobody comes home and it's like, great, how was your day? Now sit down at the table and do 3 more hours of work. Like, that's not what we want kids to be doing. We want them to be outside. We want them to be developing their fine motor skills and their gross motor skills and their communication skills in teams and outside of school. So I really think they have to have that time that's their own. Especially we talk about, mental health and well-being. Like, it's so important that they have that time to take care of themselves.
Plus, they are much more open to learning, and they learn much better if they have had time to run around, if they have had time to just make somersaults and roll in the mud if needed, or climb the trees. Yeah. It's the children learns through movement. In our school, we try hard, and in our school, children can move around a lot during also their lessons. They are not seated for 45 minutes at the desks, but in many other schools they are, and that's not how humans live and develop and learn.
You can look at even the research behind schools that took away PE or sports versus schools that didn't, the impact of students having 30 minutes of activity before school starts versus kids who don't. What happens the more fresh air they get? I mean, it's just, even within the school day, we have to make sure that we're building intentional time that kids get to move around and play, because fresh air is important. Physical activity is important.
No, it is. I remember my times. But I remember in the 5th grade, one big problem was that, okay, you go to PE, but afterwards you have like 2 maths lessons and you're sitting there.
Sweaty.
Sweaty, yeah. But that's the only drawback. Like, you felt more fresher afterwards, so that's true. There's some truth to it, to what you're saying. But okay, and now we're moving on to our third segment, which is promoting effective teaching practices. Amanda, first question goes out to you about evidence-based methods. What strategies have you found to be particularly effective in engaging students and activating their critical thinking skills at school?
Is that it? Jeez.
Yeah.
That's a big one. I think part of it is engagement matters, and kids feel more engaged when they have ownership and agency of their learning. So the more opportunities that kids have to have choice, so rather than saying we're going to do a unit on the French Revolution or like something, then you would say, like, let's talk about conflicts in general and have them do case studies around how conflicts or revolutions start, and then they would be able to, that's where that conceptual part comes from, because they could read multiple case studies and then say, oh, well, it seems like revolutions happen when there's not enough resources or boundary issues or conflicts amongst people. Okay, so let's decide if that's true or not. And then they're going to say, this is how revolutions start, rather than me stating, okay, today we're going to talk about the French Revolution, whether you want to or not, or whether it has any meaning in your life, and then go through every event of the French Revolution, versus them saying, let's look at multiple things. Let's draw conclusions around why people fight. Let's talk about how revolutions start. And then they would unpack all of that, and they have the ownership, they have the agency, they get to develop their own bit. And then at the end we say, what do we know about revolutions now? Like, how do conflicts start? And then they say it rather than the teacher says it. So they've had, a week of work that they cared about, and then they come away with the same thing that I could have told them in 5 minutes, but they're not going to learn it. Did that answer your question?
That did indeed answer my question.
And with the lower end, younger end, the base of the education, I would say that the children learn through doing. And if they can really do, if they can experiment, if they can feel the learning, that will stick much better. For example, earlier you asked about the worksheets. And imagine a little 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 4-year-old having a worksheet where there is a number on one side and a number of little pictures on the other side, and they have to draw the line to match which number is the corresponding number of pictures. In the page, there are either 5 or 10 sometimes, and then they have to color it, and it's just usually we'll just scribble over it because the pictures are too small for them to color. And they can have real numbers out of wood, out of clay, whatever, and then they have tons of little objects that they can match. They can put the number, and they can put as many objects are there. And this is like an open-ended task. They are not limited to just those 5 or 10 numbers which are on the page. They can do it for a long time. Plus, their fine motor skills are working. They are moving. They're doing something physically, which a movement of each number helps them to understand what it actually. Each item helps them understand what it means. In like a little bit older students learning about compound words, they can have a worksheet where they have to like match 2 different words, which word it is going to make, or they can have physically cut parts of the words, and they can work in groups and then find, okay, if I put together this word, this and this part, does it make sense or not? If I put those together, does it make sense or not? Okay, this makes sense. It doesn't make sense. Why? So a lot of comparison and thinking and trying out.
And could you also explain a little bit deeper why is it important to have this physical stuff so they can move around? Because I know that, but I don't know why is it like so. Because I've heard it, oh yeah, if it's physical, it's a lot better as it involves more senses. Is that it? Or
more senses, and especially young children, they learn through all senses. And the more senses we can involve, the better. It's just like when children are born, that's how they learn about the world, through their senses, and it's just coming through. And the better picture they have, the more senses are involved. Plus, Amanda mentioned that people mostly are tactile learners, and we in general in schools we have taken the tactile thing out.
There's also this idea that sort of your blood is going to like slowly just sort of pool up in your bum and in your legs, right? Like you have to keep moving if you want your blood to be flowing, and you need it in your brain to do the thinking. And also it's the time that your cerebellum, which is like your balance and stuff like that, helps with, that's the only time in school that you're going to get the opportunity to do that. If I'm moving around, if I have to get up and say like this goes with this, I'm developing those parts of your brain that you don't want pruned. See?
Pruned. Yeah, I'm seeing. And the next one goes out to you, Ginta. Could you share some examples of how such practices have promoted critical thinking and problem-solving skills among students in ISR? So firstly, it was about engaging students, and now it was like more broadly about such practices which have been introduced in the International School of Riga. I remember
the time when we changed our preschool, our early years around, to have more play-based, to have more like really learning through play rather than play being something on the side. This is, okay, you play after you have done what the work that teachers have told you to do. And then the teacher had students, they were experimenting with water, with sponges, and the teacher had a big sensory table, basically a tub, with a little bit of water, and children were playing with water, and then she tossed sponges in. And the sponges soaked up the water, and then children were just like, wow. She said this thinking that happened at that time, how they were trying to lift them, how they were squeezing them, how they were trying to soak up that water. She said that she in her life had not seen young children inquire that much. Another example from, I think last year, I think it was last year. We had that was in grade 5. We had new students who had that school year joined from different schools, and knowing the school systems in those countries, I believe that's so. I can't say for sure, but I believe it's pretty similar to what it was when I went to school. So when teacher tells what to do, and most of the learning happens on paper with pencil or pen. And in math, what they had to do, they had to visualize like a city where it was, they were given the view from the top and from 2 sides, I believe, or from 3 sides, but not from all sides. And each building was different height and different color. And they had to recreate the city with blocks. So visual thinking, understanding, trying to make connections. Students who had gone through our school, who had hands-on experiences in not just with early years with building blocks and everything else in math throughout grade 1, 2, 3, 4, they have lots of manipulatives. They had no problem at all visualizing how is it going to be. And those students who had come from different school systems where it's mostly on paper with pencil, they were totally lost. They had no idea how to visualize this thing that's on paper in 3 dimensions.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, maybe those were just those students as well, but I hope that that's our school.
I think the interesting thing is when you think about the critical thinking skills that happened with the sponges, and then you translate that to 6th and 7th grade science when they have to talk about weather. And now you're talking about like clouds and precipitation, that transfer, that's where you want the transfer to be, that you can take this experience like, oh, it soaks up, and then when you squeeze it, now you're going to talk about the pressure with weather and how it rains and what happens with clouds and condensation. Like you get to this place with them, but it starts from having this experience like, oh, the water goes somewhere. So you're looking at evaporation, and then you're going to look at how clouds fill up and then rain comes, right? Like this transfer happens, and it's those little things that we don't see. But if they've never had that experience, it's really hard to picture, like, why would a cloud, like, all have water?
Conceptualize,
yeah. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So you build those skills for them to transfer to another space.
Okay. Actually, that kind of brings us to a close. I want to thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us here.
Yeah, for sharing your invaluable insights with us. So if we had to reflect, what would be the most important things? So firstly, we use sponges when it comes to to conceptualize clouds. We use different kinds of teaching methods. We focus on, the studies not being dry, so that the children can engage. I think
if you could wrap it all up into something, it's that the ownership has to be on the kids. Like teachers used to feel like they owned the information, and that's not true anymore because kids have access. So it's so much now about handing it over to the kids, that trusting them to do the work, because they're smart and capable people. And I think as teachers have always been like, look, we're the sage on the stage and we're the most important people in this classroom, but that's just not true. The kids are so important, and their agency and ownership matters. So there's sort of this, the sage on the stage is over, and now we're guides on the side, and we help kids develop their own meaning. Like they are not bound to our meaning.
And what you mentioned, it's what you said in the university, it's more important to learn how to learn. Mm-hmm. It's throughout the school years, learning how to learn. And that's where teachers' job is, to provide opportunities so they could make those connections. They could come to their own conclusions. They could evaluate, and they could see what's right and what's wrong, so rather than just seeing everything what's right and how it should be.
I don't think I can add anything.
Well, we can go, this is my favorite quote, that the illiterate of the next century aren't those who can't read, but it's those people who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn information.
I think that's a great way to end our podcast. Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll meet you next time.